To me, it feels really fair to say that no matter what generation you are, we all kind of want the same things from our jobs and out of our jobs. I personally believe that we all want meaningful careers. We want to have a good workplace and good workplace relationships. So you want fun coworkers. You don't want your boss to be a micromanager. You don't want them to be second guessing you all the time. You want a good workplace. You want to be paid fairly so that way the work that you do actually allows you to lead a life outside of work. Because again, we work to live. We don't live to work. And we kind of like our work to serve a broader purpose and not just have us feel like we're some kind of cog in the machine that can be replaced at any moment. That's why, keeping everything simple, let's talk about why there actually feels like there is so much common ground between each generation and each group and what we want out of work, and why we happen to keep missing the mark. Welcome back to the Keeping Everything Simple podcast. I'm your host and fellow learner, Michael Klukas, and on this show, we try to boil down complex topics into simple, actionable tips. And so, what I mentioned earlier, like these kind of like 4 or 5 kind of core values that we tend to have. And to me, this seems to be the case across any generation. Doesn't matter if you're Gen Z, millennials, Gen X, baby boomers, it honestly doesn't matter because you want work that you enjoy. You want to be paid well so you can actually lead a life outside of work. You want to have a good workplace. You want to have a good boss and good coworkers, and you want it to kind of serve a broader purpose. That feels very reasonable to me. And I would imagine for most of you, just from like a core basis point, that kind of resonates with you too. And I think there's a lot of problems when we start missing the mark here on what exactly each group wants, when it kind of gets misconstrued or one conversation gets taken up or taken over by some generalization, and it can just be this almost self-fulfilling prophecy, I would say is the best way to put it, on if you categorize one group as one thing and only ever look at them like that, that's probably what's going to happen. That is inherently what a self-fulfilling prophecy would be. But again, I want to talk about these kind of core values that we want out of work and just why the conversation doesn't revolve around that so much as revolving around what makes us so different. The first thing is honestly this idea of like laziness bias, and I don't know if that's an actual terminology for it. I'm just deciding to term it as that just for the sake of simplicity here, is that no matter what generation you are in, for the younger generation, usually to some degree is seen as lazy. And that can be taken a number of ways. It can be for millennials, it was narcissistic. For Gen Z, it is self-obsessed. So I feel like almost a step beyond narcissism. I haven't done a whole bunch of research just yet into Gen X and baby boomers as to what that looked like for them in their early 20s, what life looked like for them. But at the same time, this has been a continual trend that has been acknowledged, is that no matter what, the previous generations would look to the newer and younger cohort and just say, hey, you guys are inherently not working as hard. You guys aren't putting in the same amount of effort. You're not having the same struggles that we did. You're lazy. And that's entirely false. If you caught it from a past couple of episodes, then you would hear me talking about how for Gen Z, we're not as lazy and we're actually as motivated, if not, so we are actually as motivated as other generations too. Like for most of us, we're having or juggling 2 jobs. At this point in time, I feel like it's more common for someone to have a side hustle in some form or some capacity, no matter how successful it is, versus not having a side hustle. And it just begs the question, where does that laziness bias come from? And for me, it's just, again, this conversation between maintaining the status quo, going along with change, and at the same time kind of figuring out where our common ground is. And if we're choosing to focus on one thing, like, yeah, in the US, our attention spans are kind of bad, kind of putting it lightly. And yeah, I enjoy Reels and I enjoy TikTok, but at the same time, I am well aware that it is probably a negative and hindrance to my attention span. And that's why I don't use it as much. But at the same time, it's still that conversation like, well, that's what the younger generation's like. But then what about the older generation? There's a photo, which I don't remember where I saw it, but it was a pretty good representation of like nowadays the conversation is about younger generation, so my generation or millennials, being stuck to our phones, always reading something, always on social media. And then there's an older photo of, I believe it's Gen X or baby boomers, all on the bus, their faces buried in the newspaper. And just recognizing that, it's not so much that we're different, it's just that our mechanisms and the things that we're using in our modern day life have just evolved and changed. And so it's, to me, less this conversation about, hey, one group is just so lazy, they're so entitled, they don't want to work, or whatever the situation or conversation may be, and is more this idea that, hey, their world's different than mine was, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does need to be recognized as a different thing. And in recognizing things as different, it also goes to show like what we're talking about. Like there's I believe it's called like Money Talk or whatever it is on TikTok. But you see like the personal finance space on YouTube is exploding with a lot of people. So either both young generations, so people of my cohort, Gen Z going on there, people like Graham Stephan, Andre Jick, Humphrey Yang, Meet Kevin, and it just goes on and on and on. Because then we have other ones like Your Rich BFF, so her podcast, that's a good one as well. Recommend it. But we have this conversation and this culture around money that we're making it more transparent. Like for me to wonder, hey, what does my coworker make, and feeling more okay asking that, to me, that's a good thing. That creates transparency. And I mean like true salary and job transparency. And then same thing on me choosing to ask for a raise when I was still in retail for like after my first year. I'm thinking, hey, I have a little bit of one, but I think I should get a little bit of a higher one. Not anything crazy, but just an extra 50 cents. And again, that in of itself feels very small in the grand scheme of things, but it was good practice for me to say, this conversation around money needs to be transparent. I don't need to hide what I'm making. I don't need to hold it so close to my chest that no one knows how much I'm actually making. And instead saying like, yeah, no, like for right now, I know what I'm making. I know what my coworker makes, or I'd like to know what my coworker makes, and that should be okay. Because it's not me trying to snoop, it's just trying to, again, level the playing field for everybody and create transparency around the conversation about money. Because, yeah, there was a generational shift where previous generations, and this is, again, me making the statement based off articles, videos, and, general conversations that would be had, was that money was not talked about. Like Ramit Sethi has a Netflix series now called I Will Teach You to Be Rich, based off of his concepts, based off of his book. And it's this overall group of people that don't know about money. They didn't have good conversations about money. They may be actually making a fair amount, but they're living paycheck to paycheck. And for, I believe it's almost 75% of millennials are doing so. And like 60%, so almost like 1 out of every 2, if not a little bit more, of Gen Z are living paycheck to paycheck. And that's not good. The conversation about money has evolved and is getting more and more transparent. So is the tips and rules and advice around finance, because this is something that has to be talked about. And that is a shift that has happened, because previously it was all hush hush. You don't talk about money. You don't bring up money problems. You don't worry about where the money's coming from. You just kind of imagine it will be there. And I think this is a fantastic shift to have occurred, because it makes it more accessible for people to have these conversations. And this between the generations does create a bit of a rift, though, because we'll have one group saying, hey, how much do you make? Because 1, I want to know. 2, what does my career path look if you're in a higher position than me? And 3, is it worth it? The life that I see you lead, the life that I may potentially have if I'm following this career path after you, am I going to like what I see? These are important questions, and I believe are super valid, because for me, when I was in retail, a great example was my coworkers who were older than me, further along in their career than me. I didn't see anyone with kids. And I was like, that's not a life I want. And that's just something that I logged in the back of my brain of thinking, okay, I want to have a family one day. I want to get married. I want to have kids. And for right now, anyone that's in the age in which I would imagine they'd have kids right now doesn't. And they also don't seem to have good work-life balance. And they're making more than me. Something's not adding up. And that was kind of that trigger for that conversation to occur. And I think, again, this, bringing it back to the topic of money here, is just a difference between the generations in that now being very conscientious about what our career path will look like, what our finance could potentially look like, is a good strength to have. But now, as we're having that conversation younger and younger, it can come off very abrupt, because this brings me to the next point of there's a lagging communication between the generations. Like a huge rift between us to be able to say, if Gen Z wants to talk about a raise, but we're very conflict avoidant because of XYZ reason, I have to look into that more. But I know that the overall census is that we are very conflict avoidant. And then having one generation where it's like, hey, you just have to maintain the status quo. So we're also conflict avoidant, but it's just we're further along in our career, so you kind of have to go with it. And that's not good. For me personally, I do think there has been just this lagging effort to really bridge this kind of communication between the generations and between your coworkers, because for me to then say and go up to a coworker that was a millennial, Gen X, a baby boomer, and then have a in-depth conversation about them, for me it felt fine. But at the same time, I'm also, even though I'm part of Gen Z, I'm still in that micro generation where there's the transition period between millennials and between Gen Z. So I can understand a little bit of both sides here, where no, unfortunately for my counterparts and my cohort here, I don't believe that fresh out of college with the bachelor in hand and maybe only a summer job as like a lifeguard or some babysitting experience, that you should get a 6-figure salary. This is obviously dependent on field. I would like to put that disclaimer out there. It is very dependent on the field and your specialty. But across the board, generally, like for myself, yes, it would have been fantastic to make 6 figures right out of the gate. But I didn't put in the work to make that happen. I got my bachelor's in business management, but at the same time, even though it was probably possible, I didn't put in that work for it beforehand and lay that foundation to make it a reality. And so that'd be like one piece of conversation for Gen Z. Then on the flip side of the coin here, for millennials, Gen X, and baby boomers, no, I don't believe that Gen Z, are lazy and entitled. In fact, I believe that you want to hold on to that status quo so much because, again, there's this idea of like shared experiences, shared struggles that kind of creates this overall cohesiveness in a way. But I don't believe that's the way that we should be trying to maintain the status quo, maintain just everything that's been built, as opposed to reevaluating, actually being okay, saying, hey, things are different now. The world has changed, because you can't fight change. You can only delay it if possible. And to have that conversation and say, okay, this new generation, they want opportunities. They want a life that they enjoy leading. They want careers that they actually want to go to and enjoy being at. And for us, which chose to stay where we are, even if we are just here to put in hours, even if we're just here to pay the bills, we'll stay here because it's safe and secure. This new generation doesn't understand that we have bills to pay. This new generation doesn't understand that we have a mortgage, that we have insurance. It's like, no, we do. It's just your life doesn't seem like it was, directed by you. It seemed like you fell onto a track and you went with it, as opposed to making your own track. And that's the other side of this conversation, where, to me, everyone is trying to go for the same exact thing. A life well led, a career you enjoy, being paid sustainably, and actually having a broad impact and good relationships in work and in life. And to me, that makes sense. So then why does that conversation get missed so much? And it's because we can't communicate effectively. This is not something that we're really taught in school, and this is something that I am very, very frustrated with, is that growing up, going through middle school, high school, college, you aren't taught really like effective conflict resolution. You learn about communication, how to write a good essay and communicate your point, but then more often than not, unless you really go out of your way, you're not going to be able to then translate that into a in-person social skill set to say, all right, cool, I can actively listen. I know how to change my mode of communication actually and get out of the one that I work best in and move into the one that this person I'm talking to works best in. That is not something we are taught. It's something that we either get a crash course in as we grow older, or it just kind of suffers and we kind of let it be. And that is an inherent problem. And I think from that, this kind of leads into each generation, each group being pitted against each other, because there actually, as unfortunate as it is probably some benefits, and this is all my speculation here, some benefits to there being that generational divide and that generational gap. This is complete hypothesis here, so don't take this as, the overall state of the world. No, it's just my thought process from observations, is that it probably could logically make sense that having one group pitted against another, again, maintains the status quo in some form or another. The best example I have of this is millennials, in which you were called lazy, you were called entitled as well, you were told that you're not saving enough because you're spending all your money on avocado toast, and if you didn't do that, you could buy a house, and if you had moved out of your parents' basement, then you'd be able to have a family by now, and just yada, 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 every excuse underneath the sun. Because that kept the groups before you where they were. It kept their experiences as the experience to have of, this is the life I led, you got to lead it too, why aren't you leading that? And then not taking into account the, cost of living, college tuition, student debt, the actual conversation about money growing more and more. And then also the explosion of the internet, and now how that in of itself is new opportunities, because 5 to 10 years ago, the jobs that are exploding today didn't exist, and now there's new opportunities. And it's still these groups being pitted against each other that allows this kind of, again, status quo to be maintained of, hey, our experience, how we got here is the way to go, versus the new groups coming through and saying, hey, that makes sense, but also what you went through also was unsustainable. It looks like it sucked, and I don't want to go through that. I want to go through life in a different way, and that should be okay. And I will say that my other theory here is that aside from there being probably some fringe benefits to groups being pitted against each other, that there is probably this other underlying cause here, and that for each generation, we are avoidant in some capacity, some way. That's just what I think the situation is. And for myself, knowing like my relationship style, I'm conflict avoidant, just as a whole, that and it lends itself to a lot of different problems. And if I were to take what I know about avoidance and kind of overlay it into each generation, you can see some kind of broad trends. So for one generation, is maybe Gen X or baby boomers, the conversation around mental health was avoided. So the conversation was more, hey, you got to stick to it. You got to just, if you're on this path, you stick to it, you grind it out. It doesn't matter. You pay the bills, you provide, you support, and that's it. That's your life. Whereas I think for millennials, the conversation became a lot of this work-life balance, where originally this topic was avoided, but now as they're getting older, now as they're settling down, buying houses, having families, having kids, this becomes something that they can't avoid anymore. And for us in Gen Z, the data's still out, but I would say for right now, it seems that this conversation around like personal development and professional development is something that we've not necessarily avoided, but the conversation hasn't caught up with us yet, where we lack the social capital that the generations before us had. We lack the professional skills and the etiquette in certain areas in which, again, aren't necessarily taught to you in college and in high school. And having a virtual world for the past 3-4 years here didn't exactly translate into these real life skills. And to me, each generation avoided one problem or another. And that's kind of become an overarching trend that can be addressed as long as, again, going back to what I said previously, the communication between each group improves, because again, it's not just about mentors being older, wiser individuals that are going to lead someone else down a path. It's also about someone younger being able to teach and guide someone older than them into how change is occurring. Again, it's about the teacher and the student teaching each other. Honestly, just think about how much we would be able to improve and do with effective and active communication between everyone in the workplace and everyone that you're close to in your personal life. The idea of de-escalation, so being able to, of course, remain emotionally professional at work, not just dumping all your emotional baggage onto your coworker or your boss, and at the same time feeling safe enough and comfortable enough to be vulnerable when the time arises, because your boss has the emotional intelligence, your coworkers have the emotional intelligence to say, hey, it sounds like and just feels like right now you're going through quite a lot. Something seems a little bit off right now. If you want to talk about it, I'm here to do so. And at the same time, let me know if you just need to take a day or two and kind of recalibrate, resituate yourself, and then come back to the table. That in of itself is de-escalation. It's not just a Gen Z or a millennial feeling burnt out, feeling anxious, and having a panic attack in their boss's office because they feel so overwhelmed, and then their boss saying like, hey, get over it. What are you worrying about? It's not my problem. As opposed to having high emotional intelligence and saying, hey, this is something that sounds and feels very heavy right now. This is what I can do right now to support you. Let me know what else you might need to get back to 100%, to get back to baseline. That then moves us to like conflict resolution, because again, we're very conflict avoidant as a generation. And I can imagine why, but I want to give more research into that before I actively talk too much about it. But as a whole, it does seem like we're conflict avoidant. And at the same time, we were never taught, again, how to have healthy conflict. For those of us who are kind of the outliers or who are actively trying to talk about how to have good active conversations, how to go through difficult topics like the topic of how to ask for a raise, how to navigate a conflict with a coworker, with your boss even, and not doing what I did. We'll get back to that later on. But it's still this overall skill set of conflict resolution that paired with de-escalation would be so valuable for all of us to really emphasize, because it's not a skill set that we're practicing actively and at the same time not being taught actively, which is the other side of the coin here, which kind of just defeats the purpose of saying this one generation is so conflict avoidant and then not being taught the skill set. It doesn't make sense and it doesn't add up. And finally, knowing that for de-escalation, for conflict resolution, you have to know active listening. And this is something I mentioned a little bit ago, was this idea of active listening isn't just being able to listen to understand, not just to respond to what someone is saying, but then also being able to change your communication style to match what that other person uses best. Because for me to go overly analytical and go super logical, that makes sense to me. However, that doesn't work all the time with my friends or with my partner, to be able to just say, I'm going to stay super logical, super analytical here, and you want me just to maintain the space, let you kind of talk about what you're feeling and what you're thinking. This active listening and active communication is something that we need to be taught, so that way we can continue to improve how the generations work together and how even just in the common workplace, each coworker and team works together. Because this impacts every dynamic from coworker to coworker, team member to boss, your life outside of work. It impacts so much. And it's not a skill that you're actively taught unless you seek it out, as opposed to this being like, again, the bare minimum and baseline that you need to know. Because I really believe that we just need to have a proper conversation about wants and needs, especially as, again, this multi-generational workforce comes together and learns to do collaborative work together, and effectively so. Because I don't believe our wants and our needs are that different. We want, again, a good job that's fulfilling. We want a good boss that supports us. We want good coworkers to have good relationships with. We want a sustainable income, and we want work that has a broader impact where we don't feel that we're replaceable, that we can just be gone one day and replace the next. I really do believe that we're constantly told that we're so different, that we can't work together, that for right now, Gen Z is on the chopping block because they're so hard to work with. And I believe it's just because that is one way in which we can avoid, or that larger groups can avoid having that conversation of what really works, what makes sense, what does this new generation bring, and what am I just holding on to while trying to delay the inevitable. That change comes and change happens. 5-10 years now down the road, the workforce is going to look very different. We don't know what's going to be available in the workforce. And I think that proper conversation between where our common ground lies and less about the struggles and the barriers that divide us will lend itself to a much more proactive conversation and a much more developed and impactful system of work, as well as a better balance between our lives and the careers that we choose to lead. Because again, you deserve a life and career that you love. You only get one. Comment down below, if you're watching this on YouTube, what is the difference that you think between Gen Z and the other generations, or just any generations in whole, is highlighted, yet at the same time actually isn't a problem? Because I imagine there's probably quite a few of them out there in which it's highlighted as this big conflict, this big thing that we'll never get over, but at the same time is probably a footnote among all the other things that we have in common. So with that, if you watch this on YouTube, be sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps me out so much. If you're listening to this on your favorite podcast app of choice, be sure to give us a rating on the iTunes store. It helps out the show tremendously and helps other people like you discover it. And honestly, there's a lot that I want to say about this topic, but I'm just glad that you guys actually tune in to listen to it, because there's a lot of research here that I want to dive into and I'm still compiling. And I hope that in the future, as the show develops, we'll be able to dive into it more and more and figure out, again, how to build the life and career that we love while keeping it simple. So I hope you have an amazing day, you amazing people, and go out there and do great things.